History of England, Chapter 9, Part 9. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of England, from the Accession of James II, by Thomas Babington Macaulay, Chapter 9, Part 9. In the summer of the year 1688, the archbishopric became vacant. Fürstenberg was the candidate of the House of Bourbon. The enemies of that house proposed the young Prince Clement of Bavaria. Fürstenberg was already a bishop, and therefore could not be moved to another diocese except by a special dispensation from the Pope, or by a postulation, in which it was necessary that 2/3 of the chapter of Cologne should join. The Pope would grant no dispensation to a creature of France. The Emperor induced more than a third part of the chapter to vote for the Bavarian prince. Meanwhile, in the chapters of Liège, Münster, and Hildesheim, the majority was adverse to France. Louis saw, with indignation and alarm, that an extensive province which he had begun to regard as a fief of his crown was about to become not merely independent of him, but hostile to him. In a paper written with great acrimony, he complained of the injustice with which France was on all occasions treated by that see which ought to extend a parental protection to every part of Christendom. Many signs indicated his fixed resolution to support the pretensions of his candidate by arms against the Pope and the Pope's confederates. Thus Louis, by two opposite errors, raised against himself at once the resentment of both the religious parties between which Western Europe was divided. Having alienated one great section of Christendom by persecuting the Huguenots, he alienated another by insulting the Holy See. These faults he committed at a conjuncture at which no fault could be committed with impunity, and under the eye of an opponent second in vigilance, sagacity, and energy to no statesman whose memory history has preserved. William saw with stern delight his adversaries toiling to clear away obstacle after obstacle from his path. While they raised against themselves the enmity of all sects, he labored to conciliate all. The great design which he meditated, he with exquisite skill presented to different governments in different lights, and it must be added that, though those lights were different, none of them was false. He called on the princes of northern Germany to rally round him in defence of the common cause of all reformed churches. He set before the two heads of the House of Austria the danger with which they were threatened by French ambition, and the necessity of rescuing England from vassalage, and of uniting her to the European confederacy. He disclaimed, and with truth, all bigotry. The real enemy, he said, of the British Roman Catholics was that short-sighted and headstrong monarch who, when he might easily have obtained for them a legal toleration, had trampled on law, liberty, property, in order to raise them to an odious and precarious ascendancy. If the misgovernment of James were suffered to continue, it must produce at no remote time a popular outbreak, which might be followed by a barbarous persecution of the Papists. The prince declared that to avert the horrors of such a persecution was one of his chief objects. If he succeeded in his design, he would use the power which he must then possess as head of the Protestant interest to protect the members of the Church of Rome. Perhaps the passions excited by the tyranny of James might make it impossible to efface the penal laws from the statute book, but those laws should be mitigated by a lenient administration. No class would really gain more by the proposed expedition than those peaceable and unambitious Roman Catholics who merely wished to follow their callings and to worship their Maker without molestation. The only losers would be the Tyrconnels, the Dovers, the Albavilles, and the other political adventurers who, in return for flattery and evil counsel, had obtained from their credulous master governments, regiments, and embassies. While William exerted himself to enlist on his side the sympathies both of Protestants and of Roman Catholics, he exerted himself with not less vigour and prudence to provide the military means which his undertaking required. He could not make a descent on England without the sanction of the United Provinces. If he asked for that sanction before his design was ripe for execution, his intentions might possibly be thwarted by the faction hostile to his house, and would certainly be divulged to the whole world. He therefore determined to make his preparations with all speed, and, when they were complete, to seize some favourable moment for requesting the consent of the Federation. It was observed by the agents of France that he was more busy than they had ever known him. Not a day passed on which he was not seen spurring from his villa to the Hague. He was perpetually closeted with his most distinguished adherents. 24 ships of war were fitted out for sea, in addition to the ordinary force which the Commonwealth maintained. There was, as it chanced, an excellent pretence for making this addition to the marine, for some Algerine corsairs had recently dared to show themselves in the German Ocean. A camp was formed near Nimwegen. Many thousands of troops were assembled there. In order to strengthen this army, the garrisons were withdrawn from the strongholds in Dutch Brabant. Even the renowned fortress of Berg-op-Zoom was left almost defenceless. Field pieces, bombs, and tumbrils from all the magazines of the United Provinces were collected at the headquarters. All the bakers of Rotterdam toiled day and night to make biscuit. All the gunmakers of Utrecht were found too few to execute the orders for pistols and muskets. All the saddlers of Amsterdam were hard at work on harness and bolsters. 6,000 sailors were added to the naval establishment. 7,000 new soldiers were raised. They could not, indeed, be formally enlisted without the sanction of the Federation, but they were well drilled, and kept in such a state of discipline that they might without difficulty be distributed into regiments within 24 hours after that sanction should be obtained. These preparations required ready money, but William had, by strict economy, laid up against a great emergency a treasure amounting to about 250,000 pounds sterling. What more was wanting was supplied by the zeal of his partisans. Great quantities of gold, not less, it was said, than 100,000 guineas, came to him from England. The Huguenots, who had carried with them into exile large quantities of the precious metals, were eager to lend him all that they possessed, for they fondly hoped that, if he succeeded, they should be restored to the country of their birth, and they feared that if he failed, they should scarcely be safe even in the country of their adoption. Through the latter part of July and the whole of August, the preparations went on rapidly, yet too slowly for the vehement spirit of William. Meanwhile the intercourse between England and Holland was active. The ordinary modes of conveying intelligence and passengers were no longer thought safe. A light bark of marvellous speed constantly ran backward and forward between Schevening and the eastern coast of our island. By this vessel William received a succession of letters from persons of high note in the Church, the State, and the army. 2 of the 7 prelates who had signed the memorable petition, Lloyd, Bishop of St. Asaph, and Trelawney, Bishop of Bristol, had, during their residence in the Tower, reconsidered the doctrine of non-resistance, and were ready to welcome an armed deliverer. A brother of the Bishop of Bristol, Colonel Charles Trelawney, who commanded one of the Tangier regiments, now known as the 4th of the line, signified his readiness to draw his sword for the Protestant religion. Similar assurances arrived from the savage Kirk. Churchill, in a letter written with a certain elevation of language, which was the sure mark that he was going to commit a baseness, declared that he was determined to perform his duty to heaven and to his country, and that he put his honour absolutely into the hands of the Prince of Orange. William doubtless read these words with one of those bitter and cynical smiles which gave his face its least pleasing expression. It was not his business to take care of the honour of other men, nor had the most rigid casuists pronounced it unlawful in a general to invite, to use, and to reward the services of deserters whom he could not but despise. Churchill's letter was brought by Sidney, whose situation in England had become hazardous, and who, having taken many precautions to hide his track, had passed over to Holland about the middle of August. About the same time Shrewsbury and Edward Russell crossed the German Ocean in a boat which they had hired with great secrecy, and appeared at the Hague. Shrewsbury brought with him 12,000 pounds, which he had raised by a mortgage on his estates, and which he lodged in the Bank of Amsterdam. Devonshire, Danby, and Lumley remained in England, where they undertook to rise in arms as soon as the Prince should set foot on the island. There is reason to believe that at this conjuncture William first received assurances of support from a very different quarter. The history of Sunderland's intrigues is covered with an obscurity which it is not probable that any inquirer will ever succeed in penetrating. But, Though it is impossible to discover the whole truth, it is easy to detect some palpable fictions. The Jacobites, for obvious reasons, affirmed that the Revolution of 1688 was the result of a plot concerted long before. Sunderland they represented as the chief conspirator. He had, they averred, in pursuance of his great design, incited his too confiding master to dispense with statutes, to create an illegal tribunal, to confiscate freehold property, and to send the fathers of the established church to a prison. This romance rests on no evidence, and though it has been repeated down to our own time, seems hardly to deserve confutation. No fact is more certain than that Sunderland opposed some of the most imprudent steps which James took, and in particular the prosecution of the bishops, which really brought on the decisive crisis. But even if this fact were not established, there would still remain one argument sufficient to decide the controversy. What conceivable motive had Sunderland to wish for a revolution? Under the existing system he was at the height of dignity and prosperity. As President of the Council he took precedence of the whole temporal peerage. As principal Secretary of State he was the most active and powerful member of the Cabinet. He might look forward to a dukedom. He had obtained the garter lately worn by the brilliant and versatile Buckingham, who, having squandered away a princely fortune and a vigorous intellect, had sunk into the grave deserted, contemned, and broken-hearted. Money, which Sunderland valued more than honours, poured in upon him in such abundance that, with ordinary management, he might hope to become in a few years one of the wealthiest subjects in Europe. The direct emolument of his posts, though considerable, was a very small part of what he received. From France alone he drew a regular stipend of near £6,000 a year, besides large occasional gratuities. He had bargained with Tyrconnell for £5,000 a year, or £50,000 down, from Ireland. What sums he made by selling places, titles, and pardons can only be conjectured, but must have been enormous. James seemed to take a pleasure in loading with wealth one whom he regarded as his own convert. All fines, all forfeitures went to Sunderland. On every grant toll was paid to him. If any suitor ventured to ask any favour directly from the king, the answer was, "Have you spoken to my Lord President?" One bold man ventured to say that the Lord President got all the money of the court. "Well," replied his Majesty, "he deserves it all." We shall scarcely overrate the amount of the minister's gains if we put them at £30,000 a year, and it must be remembered that fortunes of £30,000 a year were in his time rarer than fortunes of £100,000 a year now are. It is probable that there was then not one peer of the realm whose private income equalled Sunderland's official income. What chance was there that, in a new order of things, a man so deeply implicated in illegal and unpopular acts, a member of the High Commission, a renegade whom the multitude, in places of general resort, pursued with the cry of "Popish dog," would be greater and richer? What chance that he would even be able to escape condign punishment? He had undoubtedly been long in the habit of looking forward to the time when William and Mary might be, in the ordinary course of nature and law, at the head of the English government, and had probably attempted to make for himself an interest in their favour by promises and services which, if discovered, would not have raised his credit at Whitehall. But it may with confidence be affirmed that he had no wish to see them raised to power by a revolution, and that he did not at all foresee such a revolution when, towards the close of June 1688, he solemnly joined the communion of the Church of Rome. Scarcely, however, had he, by that inexpiable crime, made himself an object of hatred and contempt to the whole nation, when he learned that the civil and ecclesiastical polity of England would shortly be vindicated by foreign and domestic arms. From that moment all his plans seemed to have undergone a change. Fear bowed down his whole soul, and was so written in his face that all who saw him could read. It could hardly be doubted that, if there were a revolution, the evil counsellors who surrounded the throne would be called to a strict account, and among those counsellors he stood in the foremost rank. The loss of his places, his salaries, his pensions, was the least that he had to dread. His patrimonial mansion amid woods at Althorpe might be confiscated. He might lie many years in a prison. He might end his days in a foreign land, a pensioner on the bounty of France. Even this was not the worst. Visions of an innumerable crowd covering Tower Hill and shouting with savage joy at the sight of the apostate, of a scaffold hung with black, of Burnet reading the prayer for the departing, and of Ketch leaning on the axe with which Russell and Monmouth had been mangled in so butcherly a fashion, began to haunt the unhappy statesman. There was yet one way in which he might escape, a way more terrible to a noble spirit than a prison or a scaffold. He might still, by a well-timed and useful treason, earn his pardon from the foes of the government. It was in his power to render to them at this conjuncture services beyond all price, for he had the royal ear, he had great influence over the Jesuitical cabal, and he was blindly trusted by the French ambassador. A channel of communication was not wanting, a channel worthy of the purpose which it was to serve. The Countess of Sunderland was an artful woman, who, under a show of devotion which imposed on some grave men, carried on with great activity both amorous and political intrigues. The handsome and dissolute Henry Sidney had long been her favourite lover. Her husband was well pleased to see her thus connected with the court of the Hague. Whenever he wished to transmit a secret message to Holland, he spoke to his wife. She wrote to Sidney, and Sidney communicated her letter to William. One of her communications was intercepted and carried to James. She vehemently protested that it was a forgery. Her husband, with characteristic ingenuity, defended himself by representing that it was quite impossible for any man to be so base as to do what he was in the habit of doing. "Even if this is Lady Sunderland's hand," he said, "that is no affair of mine. Your Majesty knows my domestic misfortunes. The footing on which my wife and Mr. Sidney are is but too public. Who can believe that I would make a confidant of the man who has injured my honour in the tenderest point, of the man whom, of all others, I ought most to hate?" This defence was thought satisfactory, and secret intelligence was still transmitted, from the wittol to the adulteress, from the adulteress to the gallant, and from the gallant to the enemies of James. It is highly probable that the first decisive assurances of Sunderland's support were conveyed orally by Sidney to William about the middle of August. It is certain that, from that time till the expedition was ready to sail, a most significant correspondence was kept up between the Countess and her lover. A few of her letters, partly written in cipher, are still extant. They contain professions of goodwill and promises of service, mingled with earnest entreaties for protection. The writer intimates that her husband will do all that his friends at the Hague can wish. She supposes that it will be necessary for him to go into temporary exile, but she hopes that his banishment will not be perpetual, and that his patrimonial estate will be spared. And she earnestly begs to be informed in what place it will be best for him to take refuge, till the first fury of the storm is over. The help of Sunderland was most welcome, for as the time of striking the great blow drew near, the anxiety of William became intense. From common eyes his feelings were concealed by the icy tranquillity of his demeanour, but his whole heart was open to Bentinck. The preparations were not quite complete. The design was already suspected, and could not long be concealed. The King of France or the city of Amsterdam might still frustrate the whole plan. If Louis were to send a great force into Brabant, if the faction which hated the stadtholder were to raise its head, all was over. "My sufferings, my disquiet," the prince wrote, "are dreadful. I hardly see my way. Never in my life did I so much feel the need of God's guidance." Bentinck's wife was at this time dangerously ill, and both the friends were painfully anxious about her. "God support you," William wrote, "and enable you to bear your part in a work on which, as far as human beings can see, the welfare of his church depends." End of Part 9.